Star Wars is dead.
Is it really dead? And the answer is, of course, yes.
Star Wars is dead. Reality is, this term is confined around Disney's Star Wars, more specifically, Kathleen's version of Star Wars. The general consensus around the use of the term dead franchise is that it describes one that is unable to turn a profit through stagnation and is seeing a decline in returning and new viewers as a result of negative reception of the new product. This includes not just the movies and shows, but also the theme parks and merchandise. But how did we get here? Surely Star Wars is too big to fail. Disney is too big to fail. Fortunately, customers have way more power than companies are willing to admit. Without customer money, they are unable to sustain poor quality content. But in order for a business such as Disney to see such decline, it has to fail repeatedly, as to see audiences stop making the effort to watch their new products. And in many cases, they also alienate the very audience that is keeping the franchise profitable, keeping them away for good. The most effective case that is a shining example of this power consumers have is with Bud Light, which alienated the very customers that they were dependent on selling their product to, and they are yet to recover and most likely never will do, especially with the knock-on effects it is having. So now everyone is on the same page, we can begin by discussing how we actually got to this point. It is important to stress how impressive a feat like this is, with how much effort it takes to kill a franchise of this magnitude. Let's start with a brief history of what has happened since the acquisition. In 2012, Disney acquired Star Wars with the promise made to George Lucas that they will turn his planned sequel trilogy into movies, which eventually was backtracked on, and instead in 2015 we were given J.J. Abrams' first entry to the sequels. Whilst extremely safe, it made Disney a gross estimate of around $2 billion. Do bear in mind, this is not the profit of the film, as you have to take into account the theatre's percentage take and expenses it costs to market and make the film. So reality is, the profit for Disney would look more like $600 to $700 million. That is still huge for a film that was built on a half-baked story and a reused plot. In 2016, we got Rogue One. Apart from the jarring CGI faces of both Tarkin and Leia, it was a refreshing story that focused on telling the story of the spies who got Leia the Death Star plans in A New Hope, grossing around $1 billion, which for a story that isn't focused on the Skywalker family...
I wanted you here, Empress Palpatine.
For a film that is not part of the new sequel trilogy, it is a decent chunk of money, as the profit is around $300 million. But then, The Last Jedi happened. They ruined Luke Skywalker, they ruined Finn, and they created abominations like this. What is this? There were many more bad decisions and mistakes in this film, which accumulated in bringing into existence the future disaster of The Rise of Skywalker. And this film brought in around $500 million, giving false hope that there is still fertile ground to grow the franchise. This was really felt in the next release the next year with Solo. This film flopped, and this would become the normal under Kathleen Kennedy in the nearing future. Luckily for them, they had one more film to release, The Rise of Skywalker, which would become the last profitable project for Star Wars. This film was the worst received amongst audiences, only making a profit of around $250 million. The damage these films have done will be felt in the Star Wars community for decades to come.
The coronavirus is the biggest threat this country has faced for decades.
COVID happened, and Netflix was on the rise as the potential prosperity of streaming platforms became the focus of the news. As everything shut down due to COVID, Disney, in all their infinite wisdom, decided to join the streaming wars. This would be the greatest mistake in the company's history. In order to draw people into signing up to Disney+, Star Wars and Marvel switched to making shows alongside their movie, or in Star Wars' case, the overpromised yet undeliverable movies. Star Wars kicked it off with The Mandalorian, a show that was received with high praise, bringing in many new viewers to the platform. But as they continued to produce many more shows, they were unable to replicate this success, often and at scale. Bad Batch and The Tales of the Jedi would be great additions, but they didn't really drive many subscribers or talk about the franchise, as it seemed to rather contain to the hardcore fans. Kenobi and the Book of Boba, the much larger reaching shows, failed to captivate the audiences despite Kenobi having one of the largest premieres. This peak in viewership would struggle to be bested as people finally gave up on Star Wars as the growing list of failures continued to mount. Andor would help restore some goodwill, but it was hard to access for audiences who were not attuned to the much slower pace. And here we are in present time, and they ruined The Mandalorian with the third season being a complete mess of an unpolished story, with casual audiences not really talking about it, and when they did, it usually was in a negative light, showing the shrinking hype surrounding the upcoming project. And many hardcore fans are now fearing future projects, as it's just going to damage the universe further, or what is left of it. The blame for all of this does not lie on one singular person. Whilst Kathleen Kennedy is in charge, there were decisions made by others that contributed to the blame that now lies with her. Bob Iger is one that manages to avoid much of the criticism. In 2019, Insider released an article where they claimed Bob Iger admitted to rushing the sequels, or in his words, might have put a little bit too much in the marketplace too fast. This means that he knew that a film a year was too many. This does not really explain if he thinks the quality of the films were bad, just that he thought that they should have been released over a longer period of time. He also was the one that convinced George to sell the franchise and gave him the false pretense that he would use George's plans for the sequels. When this ultimately came out, many fans who loved George Lucas's work were rightfully upset, but as Kathleen had been put in place to run Star Wars, this ended up being laid on her, as she would be the one to take charge in creating a brand new sequel trilogy. She had a chance to use George's plans, but chose not to. Kathleen also had a chance to push back at the production pace, but chose not to, or at least what is known publicly. Despite Bob Iger's involvement, J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson should not be absolved of any of the blame for the sequel trilogy. J.J. Abrams was responsible for 2 of the sequel films, and in both demonstrated his lack of imagination and creativity, with very little in The Force Awakens treading new ground as if it was just someone's attempt at copying George Lucas's homework. Despite copying his homework, he actively disliked the prequels, which would show when he avoided using any references, even if they would have been useful to justify their ridiculous decision. Kathleen would get Rian Johnson, a director who specialised in murder mysteries, to do the middle film, in which he took his work in Knives Out and applied that philosophy, a style that translates poorly to the space opera, as the need for the audiences to be misled resulted in Finn's character going on a pointless mission to achieve absolutely nothing, and resulted in a Luke Skywalker that everyone universally disliked. The writers, directors and executives also deserve to hold the blame for the failures of the many shows they've been churned out. It was reported that Kenobi originally was planned as a movie, and then had been changed to become a show. In doing so, they diluted the movie script to stretch it out long enough to make a show, which resulted in a lower quality and a less coherent story. The director then made poor decisions in how they captured this story, especially by making the fight too dark and too shaky, with many other issues present. Executives also made the decision to take 2 episodes from the Book of Boba and give them to The Mandalorian, which would not only damage Boba Fett's story, but ruin Season 3 of The Mandalorian, as not everyone is going to be interested in watching the other show, leaving the audiences with questions such as, how is Baby Grogu back with Mando? There were many more distasteful and outright bad decisions that were made, but if I included all of them, this would extend the video far too long than it already is. Kathleen is undoubtedly the person who deserves to carry the heaviest burden of the blame, with how she intentionally caused damage to the brand, how she conducted the business, and how she was responsible for not only hiring directors but greenlighting the stories that they would be responsible for creating. This means she had an overall influence over the sequel trilogy, overseeing the collapse of each story and responsible for dividing the audiences. Her success rate of getting a new film off the ground has also been abysmal, with many of them being shelved, which can be attributed to picking busy directors and rejecting others because she wants more female directors in the space. This alone is not the problem, but it's the idea she is picking directors based on their gender or who is trending at the time, which results in potentially great films from being rejected without consideration. This idea also has forced Kathleen to look for directors who are not necessarily movie directors, rather those who specialise on documentaries, as a result of a lack of those who fit her parameters. After hiring these people, Kathleen is also responsible in how they promote the projects, and so when the director says this,
I like to make men uncomfortable. I enjoy making men uncomfortable.
It reflects on her. When actors say this,
Star Wars is very like patriarchal, so it was kind of cool to have like this sort of woman-centered figure.
it reflects poorly on her. When the second one is completely factually incorrect. Bear in mind, we know lots of Disney's press tours and promotions are often scripted. She reinforces these ideas when she wears these tops with her statements and how she has conducted the business. It has been made clear that they want to force the men out of the brand, with many attempts made to make it exclusionary and aggressive towards them in some cases. The reason I point out the way she hyper-focuses on making women the focus of the Star Wars galaxy is that the focus should be on uniting people rather than causing more division. Both men and women deserve to have equal opportunities to have their story told and to tell stories, but instead they are making this a clear and conscious choice to remove men or force them into the background, even in their own show, such as Kenobi. This is often combined with using current day politics to lecture people, ultimately removing people from the universe and reducing those willing to give them a chance. If you are constantly engaging in politics, those who disagree will stop watching. If you constantly write bad stories, people will find something better. If you degrade a certain race or gender, they will stop caring. And Star Wars does all of these on scale, so it's impossible to have not turned away most of the people who would have given your film or show a chance. Ultimately, Disney has caused irreparable damage to their brand, which will likely never recover no matter the amount of effort they do to change the public's opinion. Therefore, the only way that they can move forward is for Disney to sell Star Wars or Lucasfilm as a whole. That way, the politics Disney is heavily involved in can hopefully be disconnected from the universe so that the content may benefit. Regardless of the company who purchases this, it will most often be a net positive. They would then have the tough decision of deciding how they move forward. But if I had the chance, I would go through and remove the shows or the films that were negatively received. This list would most likely include Kenobi, Solo, Mando Season 3, Book of Boba, and the sequels. So once this content has been removed, there is now a problem that arises. Making the sequels again would not guarantee success like before. Making anything will not guarantee success, as people will be hesitant to come back to the franchise. So the most reasonable idea would be to first reflect on where Disney failed in order to give the best outcome for any future projects. The failures Disney made with Star Wars was that they wanted to make a quick return, they had no clear directional plan, they relied too heavily on established characters, especially to introduce the new ones, they had ballooning budgets, they had a lack of transparency, and finally, they disrespected the world that George had built. Instead of starting with a new sequel trilogy, it would most likely be more appropriate to gauge the audience with smaller projects, either just continuing what has been working, such as Andor and The Bad Batch, or creating a lower budget yet more focused film that can display what the franchise can be. The Mandalorian Season 3 should also undergo a complete rewrite, this time not being burdened by the Book of Boba episodes, which might restore some faith. Once gauging a rough idea of how the audience is receiving these new projects, that is when you can announce a new sequel trilogy, whilst at first there will be doubt. This may dissipate once it's made clear that this sequel trilogy will be focusing on bringing George's original plans into fruition. The reason for this is because not only will the story be leagues above Disney's, but it will be received by the fans better and can turn negative press into potentially positive press. Then once these are out, you can focus on creating more films from all the different eras of the Star Wars universe, all whilst making sure that you're listening to the fans, which are making you the money, not those on Twitter who have opinions but are not willing to put money where their mouth is, but those who buy the actual movie ticket, as these are your key audience. Consider subscribing and hitting the like button to help me make more of this type of content.